I never imagined the day my own daughter-in-law would shove a suitcase into my hands and tell me to get out of the house that I helped build while my son stood behind her in silence, pretending he did not see the humiliation burning in my face. And as the door slammed behind me and the lock clicked, I walked down the driveway with nothing but a worn suitcase and the silver card my late wife once handed me on a quiet night long ago, telling me I would know when to use it, and back then I never understood what she meant. But standing in the cold with my family abandoning me like a stray, I finally did because they thought I was penniless. They thought I was defeated. They thought throwing me out would break me, but what they did not know was that the card in my pocket held a secret, powerful, enough to shatter every assumption they had ever made about me when I stepped into the bank. The manager looked bored, uninterested, ready to dismiss me just like they had until he typed the numbers and froze his breath, catching as the screen lit up with a balance so staggering he had to lock the doors before speaking. And in that moment, as the room went silent and his eyes widened in disbelief, I felt something inside me rise again. Something my daughter-in-law thought she had crushed completely. Because that was the moment I understood that what they did to me was only the beginning, and what I was about to do next would change everything for them forever. And if you stay with me, you will see exactly how far betrayal can push a man, and how sweet justice becomes when the ones who underestimated you are forced to face the truth. My name is Walter Kane. I am 68 years old, a retired construction engineer who spent 4 decades building bridges and highways across 3 states. I built my life the same way I built those structures, with patience, precision, and the belief that solid foundations could withstand any storm. I was wrong. The evening it all fell apart started like any other dinner at my son Daniel's house. Vanessa had made pot roast, which she knew I never particularly liked, but I ate it anyway and complimented her cooking. That was the kind of man I had become in the 2 years since Margaret passed. Agreeable, quiet, trying not to be a burden. I had moved in with Daniel and Vanessa 6 months after the funeral, when the silence in my own home became unbearable. They said they wanted me there. At least, Daniel said it. Looking back now, I wonder if Vanessa ever meant a single word of welcome. We sat at the dining table, the 3 of us, with Margaret's absence filling the 4th chair like a ghost. I was telling a story about our honeymoon, how Margaret had insisted on visiting every lighthouse along the Oregon coast, dragging me up spiral staircases until my knees ached. I was laughing at the memory, feeling her presence in the warmth of the words, when Vanessa set down her fork with a sharp clink against the plate. "Walter," she said, not looking at me, "we need to discuss something important." The way she said my name made my stomach tighten. Not Dad, not even Walter with any warmth, just my name, flat and cold, like she was addressing a tenant who had overstayed his lease. Daniel kept his eyes fixed on his plate. He had barely spoken all evening, pushing food around like a child avoiding vegetables. I should have known then. I should have seen the rehearsed quality of Vanessa's posture, the way she straightened her spine as if preparing for a performance. "Daniel and I have been talking," she continued, though I noticed Daniel flinched slightly at the inclusion. "We feel it's time for you to find your own place. We need our space. As a couple, I'm sure you understand." I did not understand. I looked at my son, searching for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, a joke in poor taste. "Daniel," I said quietly, "is this what you want?" He would not meet my eyes. His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might speak up, might defend me the way I had defended him countless times throughout his childhood. Instead, he nodded once, a small, defeated motion. "It's for the best, Dad, for the best." 3 words that meant nothing and everything. I felt something crack inside my chest, not dramatically, not with any sound, but a slow fracture like ice spreading across a frozen lake. My own son could not look at me while asking me to leave. I rose from the table without finishing my meal. There was nothing left to say that would not come out as begging, and I had never begged for anything in my life. I walked to the guest room that had been mine for 18 months and pulled my old suitcase from the closet. It did not take long to pack. A man my age learns to need very little. When I came back through the living room, I stopped at the wall where Margaret's photograph hung. It was from our 40th anniversary, her silver hair catching the sunlight, her smile as bright as the day I married her. I touched the frame gently, a silent goodbye that Vanessa did not deserve to witness. But she watched anyway, standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, and I caught something in her expression that chilled me. Satisfaction, almost triumph. "Don't think about coming back for anything," she said as I reached the front door. "The house will be different soon." I did not ask what she meant. I simply nodded, opened the door, and stepped into the cold February night. The air hit my face like a slap, and I stood on the porch for a moment, 68 years old, holding a suitcase that contained everything I was allowed to keep from my life. As I walked toward my truck, my hand brushed against something in my coat pocket. I reached in and felt the smooth edge of a card, thin and metallic. I pulled it out and held it under the porch light. A silver bank card, unmarked except for a series of numbers. Margaret had given it to me 3 years ago, pressing it into my palm with an intensity I never understood. "You'll know when you need it," she had said, "and when you do, trust me completely." I had kept it all this time, without ever using it, without ever asking questions. Now, standing alone in the darkness with nowhere to go, I wondered if Margaret had somehow known this night would come. I drove for nearly an hour that night, not because I had anywhere to go, but because stopping meant accepting what had just happened. The heater in my old Ford barely worked, and my breath formed small clouds in the cabin as I passed through streets I had known for decades. Every corner held a memory. The coffee shop where Margaret and I had our first date, the hardware store where I bought supplies for Daniel's treehouse, the church where we held her funeral. I could not escape her, and truthfully, I did not want to. Eventually, the fuel gauge forced a decision. I pulled into a supermarket parking lot on the edge of town, one of those 24-hour places with harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look clinical and cold. I parked in the far corner, away from the entrance, and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing, feeling the cold slowly seep through the windows and into my bones. Around midnight, a security guard approached. I saw his flashlight beam sweep across my windshield before he tapped on the glass. He was young, maybe 30, with a serious face that softened when I rolled down the window and he saw my age. I must have looked exactly like what I was, a tired old man with nowhere else to be. "Sir, you can't sleep here," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Store policy." I nodded and reached for my keys, ready to move along to some other parking lot, some other corner of shame. But he hesitated, looking at my suitcase in the back seat, at my rumpled coat, at the weariness I could not hide. "Look," he said quietly, "just stay in this corner, okay? I'll tell the morning shift I didn't see anything." He walked away before I could thank him, and I felt something catch in my throat. Kindness from a stranger, when my own son had shown me none. I reclined the seat as far as it would go and pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders. Sleep would not come easily, but memories did. I closed my eyes and found myself back in the hospital room where Margaret spent her final days, the machines beeping their steady rhythm, the antiseptic smell that never quite masked the presence of death. She had been so weak by then, barely able to lift her hand, but her eyes still held that fierce intelligence I had fallen in love with 40 years earlier. On her second-to-last day, when the nurses had stepped out and we were alone, she pressed something into my palm, the silver card. It felt cold against my skin, almost electric. "Promise me," she whispered, her voice thin as paper. "Promise you'll only use this when you truly need it, not before. You'll know when the time comes." I had tried to ask questions, tried to understand what she meant, but she squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "When you do use it," she continued, "trust me completely, no matter what you find. Trust me, Walter." I promised. Of course I promised. I would have promised her anything in that moment. She died the next morning, and in the chaos of grief and funeral arrangements, the card had become just another object I carried without thinking, a talisman of her memory rather than anything practical. Now, shivering in my truck, I reached into my wallet for a tissue and found something else instead. A folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, tucked behind my driver's license. I did not recognize it at first, but when I unfolded it, Margaret's handwriting made my heart stutter. It was a letter, undated, written in her careful script. I must have placed it there years ago and forgotten about it. The words were brief but unsettling. "My darling Walter, I hope you never read this, But if you do, please Ridley, remember that I always tried to protect our family. I worry sometimes about Daniel. Not about him, but about someone near him who doesn't have pure intentions. I may be wrong. I pray I am wrong. But if I'm not, know that I've taken steps. Trust the card. Trust me. All my love, Margaret. I read the letter 3 times, my hands trembling in the cold. Someone near Daniel who doesn't have pure intentions. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the February air. I thought back to when Daniel first introduced us to Vanessa, 5 years ago now. Margaret had been polite, welcoming even, but afterward she had asked me strange questions. Did I notice how Vanessa steered conversations toward money? Had I seen the way she looked at our house, assessing it like a real estate agent? At the time, I dismissed Margaret's concerns as overprotective mothering. She was always too cautious, I told myself, always seeing shadows where there were none. But Margaret was never wrong about people. In 40 years of marriage, her instincts about character had proven accurate time and time again. I was the one who trusted too easily, who believed the best in everyone. She was the one who saw clearly. Morning light crept across the parking lot, gray and weak, as if the sun itself was reluctant to begin the day. I sat up, stiff and aching, and looked at the silver card still resting on my dashboard. 40 years of marriage, and I had never once questioned this gift. Never checked what it was, what it held, what Margaret had prepared without telling me. Perhaps that had been a mistake. Perhaps my blind trust had been its own form of negligence. I started the engine and drove to the nearest bank, a branch of First National where Margaret had kept her accounts. The warmth inside felt foreign after a night in the cold, and I approached the counter with the silver card in my hand, feeling foolish and uncertain. The young teller smiled professionally as I slid the card across the counter. "I'd like to check the balance on this account, please," I said. She picked up the card, scanned it into her computer, and then stopped. The color drained from her face. She looked at me, then back at the screen, then at me again. Without a word, she reached for the telephone beside her and dialed an extension. "Sir," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I need to call the director. Right now. Please wait here." The teller kept her eyes fixed on her computer screen, avoiding my gaze as if I had suddenly become dangerous. Other employees noticed the commotion and began whispering among themselves, casting glances in my direction that ranged from curious to suspicious. I caught fragments of their murmurs. Probably fraud. Look at his clothes. Should we call security? I stood there in my wrinkled coat, unshaven and exhausted from a night in my truck, and understood exactly what they saw. Not a retired engineer who had built infrastructure across 3 states, just a disheveled old man who had wandered in with a mysterious card, probably trying to run some kind of scam. I considered leaving. The shame of their stares burned worse than the cold had the night before, and I had half turned toward the exit when the door to the back offices swung open. A man emerged, perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the look of a distinguished professor. He wore a tailored gray suit, and unlike everyone else in the room, his expression held no suspicion, only recognition. He walked directly to me, extended his hand, and said, "Mr. Kane, I'm Everett Sloan, the branch director. Please, come with me." The whispers stopped. The employees who had been treating me like a potential criminal now straightened at their desks, suddenly very busy with paperwork. I shook Everett's hand, bewildered, and followed him through the door into a private office lined with mahogany shelves and framed commendations. He closed the door behind us and gestured toward a leather chair. "Please, sit. Can I get you some coffee? Water?" "Just answers," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. That teller looked at me like I was holding a bomb. Everett settled into his own chair and folded his hands on the desk. His eyes were kind but serious. The eyes of someone about to deliver news that would change everything. "Mr. Kane, I've been waiting for you. For 12 years, actually. I began to wonder if you would ever come. Waiting for me? I don't understand." He reached across the desk and picked up the silver card, turning it over in his fingers with something like reverence. "I knew your wife. Margaret and I worked together at Harmon Financial 30 years ago now. She was the sharpest accountant I ever met. When I moved to banking, we stayed in touch. Professional colleagues, occasional friends." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. 12 years ago, she came to see me. She opened this account with very specific instructions. I was to contact you only if you contacted me first. If you never came, I was to let the account sit untouched forever. My mouth had gone dry. What account? Margaret never mentioned anything like this to me. Everett turned his computer monitor so I could see the screen. The numbers displayed there made no sense at first. Like a foreign language, my brain refused to translate. I blinked, looked again, and felt the room tilt slightly beneath me. $847,000. That's impossible, I whispered. We were comfortable, but we weren't wealthy. I would have known if we had this kind of money. You wouldn't have known about this, Everett said gently. Margaret built this fund separately, through careful investments over nearly 3 decades. Small amounts at first, growing steadily. She had a gift for seeing value where others didn't. By the time she became ill, the account had reached this figure. He leaned forward, his expression intensifying. But here's what you need to understand, Mr. Kane. This is only the first account. The words landed like physical blows. Only the first account. I gripped the armrests of my chair, trying to anchor myself to something solid. Margaret, my Margaret, who clipped coupons and worried about the electric bill, who insisted we drive cars until they fell apart because waste was sinful. She had been hiding a fortune I never knew existed. Why? The question came out broken, barely audible. Why would she keep this from me? Everett removed his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth from his pocket, a delay that felt deliberate. She loved you deeply, Mr. Kane. That was always clear. But she also worried about you. She said you trusted too easily, saw the good in everyone, even when it wasn't there. He replaced his glasses and met my eyes. About 8 years ago, she added a note to the account file. She wrote that someone would eventually show their true face, someone close to your family. She didn't say who, and I didn't ask, but she was certain it would happen, someone close to your family. The letter in my wallet. The questions about Vanessa I had dismissed as paranoia. The pieces were beginning to form a picture I did not want to see. You said this is only the first account, I said slowly. What else is there? Everett held up his hand. Before we get to that, you need to understand something about the timing. The account sat dormant for years. Margaret made small additions, adjusted investments, but nothing urgent. Then, about 3 weeks before she passed, everything changed. 3 weeks before she died, I remembered that time vividly. Margaret had seemed distracted, almost frantic, making phone calls she did not explain and leaving the house for appointments she would not discuss. I assumed it was related to her illness, final arrangements, the business of dying. I never imagined it was something else entirely. What happened 3 weeks before? Everett's face darkened in a way that made my chest tighten. He looked down at his desk, then back at me. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, almost reluctant. She came to me terrified, Mr. Kane. I had never seen her like that, not in 30 years of knowing her. She said she had just met someone connected to your son, and she told me that this person would destroy you after she was gone. The words hung in the air between us, heavy as funeral flowers. Someone who would destroy you after she was gone. I wanted to reject it, to argue that Margaret had been ill, perhaps confused by medication or fear. But even as the thought formed, I knew it was a lie I was telling myself. Margaret's mind had remained sharp until her final breath. Whatever she saw in those last weeks, she saw it clearly. Tell me everything, I said, from the beginning. Everett nodded slowly, as if he had been preparing for this conversation for years. It was a family gathering, about a month before Margaret passed. A birthday dinner for your son, I believe. Margaret mentioned she would finally meet Daniel's girlfriend, the one he had been serious about. I remembered that dinner. Daniel had brought Vanessa to our home for the first time, eager to introduce her to his mother before the illness took its final toll. Margaret had been gracious, welcoming, every bit the perfect hostess, despite her failing strength. I recalled thinking how well the evening had gone, how relieved I was that Margaret approved. But now, sitting in Everett's office, I wondered what I had missed. Margaret called me the next morning, Everett continued. She was agitated in a way I had never heard before. She said she needed to make changes to her accounts immediately. Urgent changes. When I asked what had happened, she would only say that she had looked into that woman's eyes and seen something cold, something calculated. That woman, not Vanessa, not Daniel's girlfriend, That woman. The dismissal in the phrase made my stomach turn. She left something for you, Everett said, reaching into his desk drawer. He withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, my name written across the front in Margaret's unmistakable handwriting. She gave me this the same day she made the changes. Her instructions were specific. I was to give it to you only if you came to me yourself, asking about the account. I took the envelope with trembling hands. The paper felt fragile, as if it might crumble at my touch. I broke the seal carefully and unfolded the single sheet inside. Margaret's words, written in her careful script, blurred as tears I had not expected, filled my eyes. "My dearest Walter," she wrote, "if you are reading this, it means what I feared has come to pass. You have been hurt, probably by someone you trusted, and you have finally come looking for answers. I wish I could be there to hold your hand, but since I cannot, let me hold it through these words instead. The woman who has entered our son's life has no love for our family. I saw it the moment I met her. Every smile was measured, every question designed to extract information about our finances, our property, our future. She is calculation dressed in charm, and I fear Daniel cannot see it. Please, my love, protect yourself. Protect what we built together, and when you are ready, open the box I have left for you. The truth is inside. All my love, forever. Margaret." I folded the letter and pressed it against my chest, unable to speak. Margaret had seen Vanessa clearly in a single evening, while I had lived under the same roof with her for 18 months and noticed nothing. The guilt was suffocating. My wife had spent her dying days preparing for a danger I refused to acknowledge, and I had dismissed her concerns as the worries of a fading mind. "There's more," Everett said gently, giving me time to compose myself. Margaret hired a private investigator, a thorough one. She wanted to know everything about Vanessa's background, her history, her connections. The investigator delivered his report about a week before Margaret passed. "Where is it?" "Sealed in a safety deposit box at this branch." Margaret's instructions were clear. The report was to remain untouched until you were ready to see it. She believed that when the time came, you would know. I thought about all the warnings I had ignored, all the signs Margaret had tried to show me, the questions about Vanessa's interest in our finances, the letter hidden in my wallet, the silver card pressed into my palm with such urgency. Margaret had built an entire fortress of protection around me, and I had walked through life oblivious to its existence. What do I do now? The question came out small, almost childlike. Everett leaned forward, his expression serious. "First, we protect what Margaret left you. I can help you establish an irrevocable trust, something that cannot be touched by anyone except you. The money will be shielded legally, completely beyond reach." He paused, choosing his next words with care. "But Walter, this only works if no one knows about it. Whatever you do, don't tell anyone about these accounts. Not your son, and especially not your daughter-in-law." The warning settled over me like a cold blanket. Everett was right. If Vanessa learned about this money, she would find a way to take it. That was what Margaret had understood, what she had tried to tell me all along. "I need to know what Margaret found," I said. "The investigator's report. What did she discover about Vanessa?" Everett shook his head slowly, and something in his expression told me the answer would haunt me. "I don't know everything, Mr. Kane. Margaret never shared the full contents with me, but I know one thing." He met my eyes, and I saw genuine concern there, perhaps even fear. "The investigator's report is 47 pages long. Whatever Margaret found, it was substantial. It was enough to make her spend her final weeks on this earth not resting, not saying goodbye, but building walls to protect you from what was coming." 47 pages. An entire dossier on the woman my son had married, compiled by a dying mother who saw what no one else could see. I thought of Vanessa's triumphant expression as I walked out the door last night, her cold dismissal of Margaret's memory, her casual cruelty wrapped in reasonable words, and I realized, with a clarity that felt like ice in my veins, that my wife had been fighting a war I never knew existed. I left the bank with my mind reeling and my legs unsteady beneath me. 47 pages of truth sat locked in a safety deposit box, waiting for me to be ready. But ready for what? To discover that my daughter-in-law was worse than I imagined? To learn that Margaret had uncovered secrets so dark they consumed her final weeks? I was not sure I wanted to know anymore. Sometimes ignorance is not bliss, but it is at least survivable. I drove without direction until I found myself at Riverside Park, the same park where I had taught Daniel to ride his first bicycle 35 years ago. I parked and walked to a bench near the pond, watching ducks glide across water that reflected a gray February sky. Joggers passed without seeing me. Young mothers pushed strollers and looked through me as if I were part of the landscape. One woman steered her child away from my bench, whispering something I could not hear but understood perfectly. In my wrinkled clothes, unshaven and hollow-eyed, I looked like exactly what the world assumed I was, a homeless man with nowhere else to go. I sat there for hours, remembering the sound of Daniel's laughter when he finally pedaled on his own, the pride in his small face as he looked back to make sure I was watching. Where had that boy gone? What had happened to the son who once trusted me with everything, who ran to me when he was scared, who told me I was his hero? Vanessa had happened. She had taken my son and hollowed him out, replacing his spine with compliance and his voice with silence. I was so lost in memory that I did not notice the woman approaching until she sat down beside me. Linda Marston, my neighbor from 3 houses down on Maple Street, the quiet widow who always waved from her garden but rarely spoke. She was perhaps 65, with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. She looked at me without pity, without judgment, without the awkward discomfort most people show when confronted with someone else's misfortune. "Walter," she said simply, "I have a spare room. Stay as long as you need. No questions, no conditions. Just an offer of shelter extended as casually as if she were lending me a cup of sugar." I tried to protest, to explain that I could not impose, but she waved away my objections with a firm hand. "I know what it's like," she said as we walked to her car. "My daughter-in-law treated me the same way before my son finally divorced her. Made me feel like a stranger in my own family. Some women marry for love, others marry for leverage." She glanced at me with understanding that cut deeper than sympathy. "You don't have to tell me what happened. I already know." Her home was warm and smelled of cinnamon, a small cottage filled with books and photographs and the evidence of a life well lived. She showed me to a guest room with clean sheets and soft light, and for the first time in 2 days, I felt something other than despair. I sat on the edge of the bed and checked my phone, dreading what I might find. One text message from Vanessa: "Don't contact Daniel again. Don't come back. This is your final warning." I showed Linda the message, and her expression hardened. "That woman," she muttered. "I've been watching her, you know. Something's wrong with her lately. She's always on the phone, pacing the driveway, looking stressed, like she's hiding something big." She paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "Walter, there's something else you need to see." She retrieved a tablet from her living room and tapped the screen several times before handing it to me. An online marketplace filled the display, listings for jewelry with photographs I recognized instantly. Margaret's antique brooch, passed down from her grandmother. The pearl earrings I gave her on our 20th anniversary. The sapphire ring she wore on special occasions, the one she always said would go to our future grandchildren. All of it posted for sale, all of it priced to sell quickly, and all of it listed by an account with Vanessa's name. The tablet screen glowed with betrayal. I scrolled through listing after listing, each photograph a knife to my chest. Margaret's mother's brooch, listed at $400. The anniversary pearls, $300. A Victorian mirror that had hung in our hallway for 30 years. A hand-carved jewelry box Margaret had treasured since childhood, even the antique dining chairs we had refinished together one summer. Everything that held meaning, everything that carried memory, reduced to price tags and shipping options. "She's been posting new items every few days," Linda said quietly. I only noticed because I recognized the jewelry. I almost bought the brooch myself before I realized whose it was. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Dad, please don't call. Vanessa says it's better this way." I stared at the words, wondering if he even knew what his wife was doing. Probably not. Vanessa had constructed a careful wall between Daniel and reality, and my son had chosen not to look over it. The next morning, Linda received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Hartley, another neighbor from my old street, arrived at the door looking nervous but determined. She was 70 years old, with sharp eyes behind thick glasses, the kind of woman who noticed everything and said little. But today, she had something to say. "I've been watching that woman," Mrs. Hartley announced as she settled into Linda's kitchen chair. Something's not right over there. Every night, after dark, she goes out to the driveway and screams into her phone. Screams, Mr. Kane, about money, about debts, about needing more time. She pulled out her own phone with the careful movements of someone unfamiliar with technology. My grandson showed me how to record videos through my window. I know it seems nosy, but after what she did to you, I thought someone should keep an eye on her. The first video showed Vanessa pacing beside her car, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing wildly. The audio was muffled by distance, but clear enough. I told you I'll get the money, she was saying. Her voice cracked with desperation. Just give me more time. I'm working on it. A pause. No, Daniel doesn't know anything. He can't know. If he finds out, everything falls apart. Mrs. Hartley swiped to another video, this one from a different night. Vanessa's posture had changed. She leaned against the car now, her voice lower, softer, almost tender. I'm trying, okay? I'm doing this for us. You have to trust me. The way she said us made my skin crawl. This was not how a woman speaks to a creditor. This was intimacy, affection. Whoever was on the other end of that call, it was not my son. There are more, Mrs. Hartley said. Weeks worth. Always about money, always secretive. That woman is in deep trouble, Mr. Kane, and she's dragging your son down with her. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Vanessa had not kicked me out because she wanted space. She kicked me out because she was drowning in debt and needed access to the only valuable asset within reach. The jewelry was just the beginning. She was liquidating everything she could sell quickly, buying herself time against whatever creditor was breathing down her neck. And when the jewelry ran out, there was only one thing left worth real money. The house. I excused myself and went to my truck, where I kept a folder of important documents in the glove compartment. My hands shook as I flipped through old tax returns and insurance papers until I found what I was looking for. The deed to the house on Maple Street. The house where Daniel lived with Vanessa. The house she was almost certainly planning to sell. I read the document twice, then a third time, my heart pounding against my ribs. The property was listed under two names, Walter Kane and Margaret Kane. When Margaret died, her share transferred to me automatically through joint tenancy. Daniel's name appeared nowhere on the deed. We had always intended to add him, to officially make it a family home, but life got busy and the paperwork never happened. Vanessa was trying to sell a house she did not own. I sat in Linda's guest room that night, staring at the deed in my hands, trying to understand how everything had unraveled so completely. Margaret and I had built a life of careful planning and modest success, and in just 18 months, a woman I barely knew had reduced it to wreckage. I was still holding the document when my phone rang. The screen showed Daniel's name, and my thumb hesitated over the answer button. Part of me wanted to let it ring, to punish him with the same silence he had shown me. But he was still my son, still the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, and I could not ignore that. Dad? His voice was barely a whisper, trembling with something that sounded like fear. Can you talk? She's in the shower. I only have a few minutes. The secrecy in his tone broke something inside me. My own son, hiding in his own home, stealing moments to speak to his father like a prisoner making a forbidden call. I'm here, Daniel. Tell me what's happening. I'm so sorry. The words came out rushed, tumbling over each other. I didn't want to ask you to leave. She said if you stayed any longer, she would file for divorce. She said I had to choose between you and my marriage. I thought if I just did what she wanted, things would calm down. I thought she would let you come back eventually. I closed my eyes, absorbing the weight of his confession. Vanessa had weaponized their marriage, holding it hostage to force Daniel's compliance. My son had not chosen her over me out of cruelty. He had chosen her out of terror, out of the desperate belief that obedience might buy him peace. It was manipulation of the coldest kind, and Daniel had been too deep inside it to recognize the bars of his cage. Tell me about your finances, I said carefully. Do you know what Vanessa has been doing with money? The pause that followed was answer enough. When Daniel spoke again, his voice had dropped even lower. I don't have access to our accounts. She handles everything. She says it's easier that way, that I'm not good with numbers. I used to have a card, but she took it a year ago, said we needed to consolidate. My grip on the phone tightened. Daniel, Do you know if you have any debts? Loans? Credit cards? I don't know. The admission came out small and ashamed. She gets the mail before I do. She pays the bills online. I tried to log into our bank account once, and she had changed the password. When I asked about it, she got so angry that I never brought it up again. This was worse than I had imagined. Vanessa had not just married my son, she had systematically isolated him from every aspect of their shared life. He was a stranger in his own household, signing checks he could not verify for a future he could not see. Has she been asking you to sign things? I asked, remembering Mrs. Hartley's recordings, Vanessa's desperate promises to unknown callers. Daniel's breath caught. How did you know that? She brings me documents all the time. Business papers, she calls them. Investment forms, tax stuff. She puts them in front of me and tells me where to sign. I don't read them anymore because she gets impatient if I take too long. She says I'm slowing everything down, that I don't understand finance anyway, so what's the point of reading? I thought of the forged signatures that might already exist, the legal tangles Vanessa could be weaving with my son's unwitting hand. Every document he signed was another thread in her web, binding him tighter while she drained whatever remained of our family's stability. Listen to me carefully, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger rising in my chest. Do not sign anything else. Nothing. I don't care what she tells you. I don't care how angry she gets. From this moment on, you read every word of every document, and if she won't let you, you refuse to sign. Do you understand? Dad, if I do that, she'll know something's wrong. She'll know I talked to you. Then don't let her know. Be calm. Be normal. But protect yourself, Daniel. You're in more danger than you realize. Silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of years we had lost to Vanessa's influence. When Daniel spoke again, his voice was smaller than I had ever heard it, the voice of a child waking from a nightmare. Dad, I've been thinking about Mom lately, about things she said before the wedding. He paused, struggling with the memory. She tried to warn me, didn't she? She took me aside the night before and said something about Vanessa, about being careful. I didn't listen. I thought Mom was just being overprotective, that she didn't want to share me with another woman. His voice cracked. But that wasn't it, was it? Mom saw something I couldn't see. The confirmation twisted in my gut. Margaret had tried. Even then, even at the beginning, she had recognized the danger and reached out to save our son. And Daniel, blinded by love or lust or simple stubbornness, had walked straight into the trap. Your mother was the wisest person I ever knew, I said softly. She saw people clearly, even when they didn't want to be seen. Whatever she told you that night, she meant it. I should have listened. God, I should have listened to her. You can't change the past, son, but you can change what happens next. Stay smart, stay quiet, and when the time is right, we'll fix this together. I heard a sound in the background, distant but distinct, a door slamming, footsteps on hardwood. Daniel's breathing quickened, sharp with sudden panic. Who are you talking to? Vanessa's voice cut through the silence like a blade, cold and suspicious. The line went dead. I tried calling Daniel back 3 times that night, but each attempt went straight to voicemail. I imagined Vanessa standing over him, demanding answers, spinning whatever lies she needed to maintain control. Sleep came in fragments, broken by worry and the persistent image of my son's face twisted with fear. By morning, I had resolved to do something I should have done long ago. Stop running and start fighting. Linda made coffee while I sat at her kitchen table, organizing the evidence I had gathered. The house deed. Screenshots of Vanessa's online listings, Mrs. Hartley's recordings saved to a flash drive, notes from my conversation with Everett about Margaret's accounts. It was not much, but it was a foundation, and I had spent my career building on foundations. We were discussing next steps when the pounding started. Not a knock, but a furious hammering that shook Linda's front door in its frame. Before either of us could react, Vanessa's voice shrieked through the wood, loud enough to alert every neighbor on the street. I know you're in there, Walter. Open this door right now. Linda rose calmly, smoothing her sweater as if preparing to greet a casual visitor. Let me handle this, she said, but I shook my head and stood beside her. I was done hiding. I was done letting others fight battles I should have fought myself. Linda opened the door, and Vanessa exploded into the room like a storm given human form. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, her eyes wild with a fury that bordered on unhinged. She wore expensive clothes that looked slept in, and I noticed for the first time how thin she had become, how the desperation had carved hollows beneath her cheekbones. "You," she spat, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "You're trying to steal my husband's inheritance. You're turning him against me with your lies." Linda stepped between us, her voice cool and measured. "Mrs. Cole, you're welcome to come inside and discuss this calmly, or you can leave. Those are your only options." Vanessa pushed past her, ignoring the invitation for civility. She stopped a few feet from where I stood, close enough that I could see the veins pulsing at her temples, the rapid flutter of her breathing. "What have you been telling Daniel? What poison have you been putting in his ear?" I met her gaze without flinching. For the first time since she had entered my life, I did not look away. "I've told him the truth. Something you seem to have trouble with." Her laugh was sharp and brittle, cracking at the edges. "The truth? You're a confused old man who doesn't know what century it is. You probably don't even remember what you said to him." She stepped closer, dropping her voice to a threatening hiss. "I've been patient with you, Walter. I've tolerated your presence in our home for far too long. But if you keep interfering in my marriage, I will have you declared mentally incompetent. I know doctors. I know lawyers. I will have you put in a nursing home where you belong, drooling into your oatmeal while the state manages your affairs." She expected me to crumble. I could see it in her eyes, the certainty that her threats would reduce me to the submissive old man she had learned to manipulate. She had built her entire strategy around my weakness, my desire to avoid conflict, my willingness to sacrifice my own dignity for the sake of family peace. But that man had died in a supermarket parking lot, shivering through a February night. The man standing before her now was someone she had never met. "Before you start making phone calls to doctors and lawyers," I said quietly, "maybe you should explain your debts to Daniel first." The transformation was instantaneous. The color drained from Vanessa's face as if someone had pulled a plug, leaving her skin the pale gray of old newspaper. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no words came out. For a long moment, she simply stared at me, and I watched the calculations racing behind her eyes, the desperate search for an explanation that might salvage her position. "What are you talking about?" she finally managed. But her voice had lost its edge. "The money you owe, the phone calls every night, begging for more time, the jewelry you've been selling online, Margaret's jewelry, items that were meant for future grandchildren." I let each word land like a stone dropping into still water. "Daniel doesn't know about any of it, does he? He doesn't know what you've been doing with his signature, either. All those documents you've been putting in front of him, all those papers he signs without reading." Vanessa's composure shattered completely. She took a step backward, nearly stumbling over Linda's coffee table, her bravado collapsing into something that looked almost like fear. "How do you know about that? Who told you?" I said nothing. Silence, I had learned, could be more powerful than any accusation. "This isn't over," she said, but the threat was hollow now, the words of someone grasping at straws. "You think you're so clever, but you don't know anything. You don't know what I'm capable of." "I know enough," I replied, "and soon Daniel will know everything." She turned and fled, not walked but fled, yanking open the front door and stumbling onto the porch. I watched through the window as she hurried to her car, and something caught my attention that I filed away for later consideration. Her hand, reaching for the door handle, was shaking so badly that she missed the latch twice before managing to grip it. This was not the hand of a confident woman executing a careful plan. This was the hand of someone drowning, thrashing against currents she could no longer control. She drove away too fast, tires squealing against the pavement, and the street fell quiet again. Linda closed the door and turned to me with raised eyebrows. "Well," she said, "that was certainly more excitement than I expected before lunch." I lowered myself into a chair, suddenly aware of how fast my heart was beating. The confrontation had taken more out of me than I wanted to admit, but beneath the exhaustion, something else was growing, something that felt almost like hope. "She's more vulnerable than she appears," I said, half to Linda and half to myself. "All that aggression, all those threats, she's not in control, she's panicking." Linda nodded slowly. "Desperate people make mistakes." I thought about the house deed sitting in my folder, the document Vanessa clearly believed was irrelevant. She was operating under the assumption that the house belonged to Daniel, that she could leverage it however she needed to escape her financial catastrophe. She had no idea that her entire plan was built on a foundation of sand. She doesn't know the house is still in my name, I said. When she finds out, her whole scheme collapses. Linda tilted her head. Are you going to tell her? I considered the question carefully. A week ago, I might have confronted her immediately, laid all my cards on the table in a desperate bid for resolution. But I was learning. I was beginning to understand that timing mattered, that patience could be a weapon more effective than any outburst. Actually, I said, I want her to find out at exactly the right moment, when it will do the most good and the most damage. The next morning, I began building my case the same way I had built bridges for 40 years, with careful planning, solid documentation, and an understanding that the strongest structures are those designed to withstand pressure from every direction. Linda drove me to Everett's office, where a lawyer named Patricia Simmons was waiting. She was a sharp woman in her 50s, with no patience for small talk and a reputation for protecting clients from predatory family members. Everett had recommended her specifically. Mr. Kane, she said after reviewing the documents I had brought, your wife was remarkably thorough. The accounts she established are already well protected, but we can make them virtually untouchable by moving everything into an irrevocable trust. Once that's done, no one can access these funds without your explicit consent. Not your son, not any spouse, not any court, short of evidence of criminal fraud on your part. We spent 3 hours reviewing paperwork, signing forms, and constructing a legal fortress around Margaret's gift. By the time we finished, my assets were shielded behind layers of protection that would take years to penetrate, if they could be penetrated at all. Vanessa could threaten nursing homes and incompetency hearings until her voice gave out. She would find nothing to take. As I was leaving, Patricia offered one final piece of advice. You have grounds to reclaim your house immediately, she said. The deed is clear. You could have her removed within 30 days. I had considered this option during my sleepless nights at Linda's house. The temptation was powerful. I could end this today, force Vanessa out onto the street the same way she had forced me, and reclaim what was rightfully mine. But something held me back, a voice that sounded remarkably like Margaret's, counseling patience. Not yet, I told Patricia. I want my son to see the truth for himself. If I force this now, he'll think I'm the aggressor. He needs to understand who his wife really is, and that understanding has to come from evidence, not from his father's accusations. Patricia studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. You're playing the long game. Smart. Dangerous, but smart. That afternoon, I met Daniel at a coffee shop on the other side of town, far from anywhere Vanessa might spot us. He looked worse than I had ever seen him. Dark circles under his eyes, his hands wrapped around a cup he never drank from. The confident young man I had raised had been replaced by a shadow, hollowed out by years of manipulation he was only beginning to recognize. I slid a folder across the table. Inside were bank statements Mrs. Hartley had helped me obtain, records showing accounts in Vanessa's name alone, accounts Daniel had never known existed, credit card debts totaling over $60,000, a personal loan from a finance company with an interest rate that bordered on criminal, cash withdrawals that corresponded exactly with the dates of her most desperate phone calls. Daniel read through the documents in silence, his face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and finally a dawning horror that made him look 10 years older. I didn't know about any of this, he whispered. She told me we were doing fine. She said we had savings. She told you what she needed you to believe, I said gently. That's what people like her do. They construct a reality that serves them and trap everyone else inside it. He looked up at me with eyes that glistened with tears he was too proud to shed. What do I do, Dad? I can't just leave. She'll take everything. She'll destroy me. You don't have to do anything right now. Just watch. Pay attention. Stop signing things you haven't read. I reached across the table and gripped his shoulder. I'm not going anywhere, Daniel. When you're ready, we'll face this together. He nodded, but I could see he was not yet ready to act. The cage Vanessa had built around him was too familiar, too comfortable in its misery. Breaking free would require him to admit that his entire marriage had been a lie, and that was a truth too large to swallow in one afternoon. I would give him time. I would give him evidence. And eventually, I would give him the strength to walk away. That evening, Linda and I sat on her back porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. I told her about Margaret's philosophy, something she had repeated throughout our marriage that I had never fully understood until now. She always said good people are eventually rewarded, I explained. Not in a religious sense, not karma or divine justice, but something simpler. She believed that kindness creates ripples, and those ripples eventually return to their source. I looked at Linda, this woman who had opened her home to me without hesitation, who had asked nothing in return. I never understood what she meant until you took me in. You had no reason to help me except basic human decency. And now here we are, sitting together, fighting the same fight. Linda smiled, a small, sad expression that held decades of her own struggles. Margaret sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was, I agreed, and she's still protecting me, even now. My phone rang, shattering the quiet of the evening. Everett's name appeared on the screen, and something in my chest tightened. He would not call this late unless it was urgent. "Walter," he said without preamble, his voice tight with controlled alarm, "we have a problem. A mortgage application was submitted for your house 3 days ago. The amount requested was $200,000, supposedly for home improvements." I gripped the phone tighter. "I never submitted any application." "I know you didn't. That's the problem." Everett paused, and I could hear him choosing his next words carefully. "The application included your signature, but our fraud department flagged it immediately. The signature doesn't match your records. Someone forged it, Walter. Someone submitted a fraudulent loan application using your identity and your property." The word forged echoed in my mind long after Everett finished explaining. I sat on Linda's porch with the phone pressed to my ear, watching the last light fade from the sky, feeling the ground shift beneath everything I thought I understood about my situation. Vanessa had not merely manipulated my son or sold my wife's jewelry. She had committed a federal crime, and she had done it with my name. "Walk me through the timeline," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. Everett shuffled papers on his end of the line. "The application was submitted electronically 2 weeks ago. That's what caught our attention first. You were still living in the house at that point, Walter. She filed this before she even asked you to leave." The implication settled over me like a cold fog. Vanessa had not kicked me out in a moment of frustration or conflict. She had planned it. The eviction was not a reaction to my presence, but a necessary step in a scheme she had already set in motion. She needed me gone so she could proceed with the loan without my interference, without the risk that I might notice unfamiliar paperwork or receive calls from the bank. Every cruel word, every manufactured argument, every tear Daniel believed was genuine. All of it had been calculated to remove the one obstacle standing between her and $200,000. "The signature," I said. "You're certain it's not mine?" Our fraud department compared it against every document we have on file. "It's close, Walter, I'll give her that. She studied your handwriting carefully. But there are inconsistencies in the pressure points, the letter formations, small details that only become visible under analysis. Whoever signed this was imitating you, not being you." I thought of all the documents Daniel had mentioned signing without reading. Had Vanessa practiced on those? Had she refined her forgery over months of trial and error, using my son's blind trust as her training ground? "What happens now?" I asked. "That's up to you. We've flagged the application and halted any processing. The evidence is preserved and documented. If you want to press charges, we can involve federal authorities immediately. Mortgage fraud is a serious offense. She could face years in prison. Prison. The word should have brought satisfaction, but instead, I felt only a weary sadness. Vanessa had orchestrated her own destruction, brick by brick, lie by lie. All I had to do was step aside and let the consequences fall. But there was Daniel to consider. My son was still trapped in that house, still tangled in the web she had woven around him. If I brought the police down on Vanessa now, Daniel would be caught in the wreckage. He might never forgive me for acting without giving him a chance to see the truth himself. "Preserve everything," I told Everett. "Document every detail. But don't involve the authorities yet. I need time. Walter, this is serious. If she realizes the application was flagged, she might destroy evidence or flee. She won't realize anything. She's too busy putting out other fires." I thought of her trembling hands, her desperate phone calls, the mounting debts that were crushing her from every direction. Vanessa was drowning, and drowning people do not notice the nets closing around them. "Give me a few days. I need my son to understand what's happening before this goes any further. Everett agreed reluctantly, and we ended the call. Linda had been listening from her chair nearby, her face drawn with concern. "What are you going to do?" I pulled out my phone and opened the camera roll. Everett had already sent me photographs of the forged application, high-resolution images that showed my fake signature in damning clarity. I studied them for a long moment, remembering all the times I had signed documents beside Margaret, our handwriting familiar to each other as our own faces. She would have spotted this forgery instantly. She would have known. "I'm going to let the truth speak for itself," I said. I composed a text message to Daniel, attaching the photographs without any words of explanation. No accusations, no demands, just the images, stark and undeniable. I hesitated for only a moment before pressing send. The minutes that followed stretched into an eternity. I sat in Linda's living room, watching my phone, remembering Daniel as a child asking me to explain how bridges stayed up. I had told him about load distribution, about tension and compression, about how the strongest structures were those that channeled force rather than resisting it. I wondered if he remembered those lessons now, if some part of him understood that his marriage had been built on foundations that could never hold. When my phone finally rang, less than an hour after I had sent the message, I answered before the first ring finished. "Dad." Daniel's voice was shattered, broken into pieces that no longer fit together. "Dad, I saw the documents. That's not your signature. I know your signature. I've known it my whole life." "I know, son. She forged it. She tried to take out a loan on your house with a forged signature." He was crying now, the sobs coming through the phone in ragged waves. "How long has she been doing this? How many other things has she lied about?" "I don't know yet. But we're going to find out together." A long silence followed, filled only with the sound of Daniel's breathing as he struggled to compose himself. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, haunted by a memory he had buried for years. "Dad, Mom tried to warn me. Before the wedding, the night before, she took me aside and showed me something. Documents about Vanessa's past. Financial records, I think. Maybe a background check. I don't remember exactly because I refused to look at them. I told Mom she was being paranoid, that she was trying to ruin the happiest day of my life." His voice cracked again, breaking under the weight of regret. I didn't believe her. I thought she was just being overprotective, that she couldn't accept me growing up and starting my own family. I closed my eyes, seeing Margaret on that night, desperate to save our son from a mistake she could already see forming. She had tried. Even then, years before her illness, she had recognized the danger and reached out to stop it. And Daniel, blinded by love and youth and certainty, had pushed her away. "What did Mom find?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What did she know about Vanessa that I refused to see?" I told Daniel everything I knew, holding nothing back. The accounts Margaret had secretly built, the investigator she had hired, the notes she had left warning about someone who would show their true face. When I finished, the silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I thought the call had dropped. "I'm going to confront her," Daniel finally said. "Tonight. I need to hear what she says when she can't hide anymore. Be careful. Desperate people do desperate things. I know, Dad, but I have to do this. I have to look her in the eye and give her a chance to tell me the truth. If she lies again, I'll know. I'll finally know for certain." The call ended, and I spent the next several hours pacing Linda's small living room, imagining the confrontation unfolding across town. I pictured Daniel walking through the door, the photographs of forged documents in his hand, facing the woman who had systematically dismantled his relationship with his father. I wondered if Vanessa would crumble or attack, confess or deflect. I wondered if Daniel had the strength to see through whatever performance she chose to deliver. It was nearly midnight when headlights swept across Linda's front window. I opened the door before Daniel could knock and found my son standing on the porch, a hastily packed duffel bag over his shoulder, his face streaked with dried tears. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world collapse, which I suppose he had. "She denied everything at first," he said, his voice hollow. "Looked me right in the eye and said I was being manipulated by you. Said you were a confused old man who was making up stories to turn me against her." He laughed bitterly. "I've heard her use that voice 1,000 times. The one that makes you feel crazy for questioning her. It almost worked. It always almost works." I stepped aside to let him in, and he collapsed onto Linda's couch like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Linda appeared from the kitchen with a cup of tea, which Daniel accepted with trembling hands. I showed her the documents, he continued, the forged signature, the bank statements, the credit card debts she'd hidden for years, and I watched her cycle through every trick she's ever used on me. First denial, then tears, so many tears, telling me how hard she's worked to keep our family together. Then anger, screaming that I was betraying her, that she'd given me everything, and this was how I repaid her. He shook his head slowly, and finally blame. It was my fault for not earning enough. Your fault for not dying and leaving us the inheritance she expected. Mom's fault for poisoning me against her before we even got married. What did you say? Daniel looked up at me with eyes that held a decade of accumulated regret. I told her she forged my father's signature. I told her that's a federal crime. I told her she could go to prison. His voice cracked. And for the first time in our entire marriage, she had nothing to say. No manipulation, no tears, no excuses, just silence. Because there was no way to spin it, no angle that could make forgery look like anything other than what it was. He set down the tea and buried his face in his hands. When he spoke again, his words were muffled but clear enough to break my heart. Mom was right. She was right about everything, and I was too stupid and too in love to listen. She tried to show me proof the night before my wedding, and I told her she was being paranoid. I told her she was trying to control my life. He looked up, tears flowing freely now. And then she got sick, and she died, and I never got to tell her I was sorry. I never got to tell her that I finally understood. I sat beside my son and placed my hand on his shoulder. The anger I had carried for months, the resentment at his silence and complicity, melted away in the face of his grief. Daniel had not chosen Vanessa over me out of malice. He had been manipulated, gaslit, trapped in a relationship designed to isolate him from everyone who loved him. He was not my enemy. He was another of her victims. I was a coward, Dad. His voice broke on the last word. I let her treat you like garbage. I watched her throw you out of your own house, and I didn't say a word. I was so afraid of losing her that I lost you instead. He met my eyes, and I saw the little boy who used to run to me when he was scared. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I pulled him into an embrace, holding my son the way I had not held him in years. He sobbed against my shoulder, releasing years of suppressed guilt and confusion, and I let him. This was not about whether Daniel deserved forgiveness. This was about what Margaret would have wanted. She would have wanted her family whole again, healed rather than fractured by bitterness. She would have wanted me to be the father Daniel needed, not the judge he feared. It's okay, I said softly. We're going to be okay. We sat together for a long time, father and son, beginning the slow work of rebuilding what Vanessa had tried to destroy. Linda quietly retreated to give us privacy, and the house fell silent, except for the sound of Daniel's breathing gradually steadying. My phone rang, jarring us both back to the present. Everett's name glowed on the screen, and I answered with Daniel still beside me. Walter, Everett said, his voice carrying a weight I had not heard before. It's time. Margaret's investigator report, the one she sealed in the safety deposit box. She left specific instructions that I was to tell you when you were ready. He paused. I think you're ready now, both of you. The report is 47 pages, and I think you'll finally understand everything your wife was trying to protect you from. Daniel and I drove to the bank together the next morning, neither of us speaking much during the journey. The silence between us was not uncomfortable but heavy, filled with the weight of revelations yet to come. Everett met us at the entrance and led us through corridors I had never seen before, down to a vault room where safe deposit boxes lined the walls like metal graves holding secrets of the dead. The box Margaret had rented was larger than I expected. Everett placed it on a table in a private viewing room and left us alone, closing the door softly behind him. I lifted the lid with hands that refused to stop trembling and found a thick manila folder inside, its edges worn from years of waiting. A handwritten label on the front read, "For Walter, the truth." I opened the folder and began to read, Daniel leaning close beside me. The investigator's report was thorough, professional, and devastating. Page after page documented Vanessa's history with clinical precision, tracing her movements and relationships for the 5 years before she entered our lives. The first section detailed her financial situation at the time she met Daniel. She had been drowning in debt even then, with multiple creditors pursuing her for unpaid loans. Her credit score had been destroyed by years of reckless spending and failed schemes. She was, the investigator concluded, actively searching for a solution to her problems, a solution that would not require her to change her lifestyle or face consequences for her choices. Then came the section that made my blood run cold. 6 months before Vanessa accidentally bumped into Daniel at a coffee shop, she had been researching the Kane family. The investigator had obtained records showing internet searches for our names, our property values, our estimated net worth. She had studied us like a predator studying prey, calculating which member of the family would be most vulnerable to her charms. Daniel, young and romantic and eager to prove himself independent from his parents, had been the obvious choice. Their meeting was not chance, it was strategy. Daniel made a sound beside me, something between a gasp and a moan, but I kept reading. The next section contained Margaret's own notes, written in her careful handwriting, describing a confrontation I never knew had occurred. I met with Vanessa privately, Margaret had written, 2 weeks after the engagement announcement. I told her I knew what she was doing. I showed her the investigator's findings. I offered her money to walk away, enough to clear her debts and start over somewhere else. She laughed at me. She said Daniel would never believe me over her. And then she leaned close and whispered something I will never forget. "You'll be dead soon, Margaret. The doctors have already told Daniel how sick you are, and once you're gone, there's no one left to stop me." My hands were shaking so badly that Daniel had to hold the pages steady for me to continue. Margaret's note at the end of the section explained everything. I tried to stop the wedding. I begged Daniel to listen, but he was in love, and love made him deaf to warnings he did not want to hear. So I did the only thing I could. I prepared for the day when Walter would need protection. I built walls she cannot climb. I created resources she cannot reach. And I prayed that my husband would forgive me for keeping secrets, because the secrets were the only weapons I had left. The final pages revealed the second account Everett had mentioned. Margaret had been building it for even longer than the first, investing carefully and quietly for nearly 30 years. The balance shown on the statement made Daniel audibly gasp. $2.3 million. Combined with the first account, Margaret had prepared over $3 million in protected assets, a fortress built over decades for a battle she knew she would not live to fight. At the bottom of the folder lay one more item, a sealed envelope with my name on it. A sticky note in Margaret's handwriting was attached. "Everett, give this to Walter only when he is ready to forgive. He will know what that means." Daniel set down the report and stared at the wall, tears streaming down his face. "Mom spent her last weeks doing this," he said, his voice barely audible. "She was dying, and instead of resting, instead of being at peace, she was protecting us from a woman I brought into our family." He turned to me, his expression shattered. "She should have been saying goodbye. She should have been holding our hands and letting us hold hers. Instead, she was fighting a war I refused to acknowledge." I could not speak. The magnitude of Margaret's love, the depth of her sacrifice, overwhelmed every word I might have found. Daniel looked at the sealed envelope still resting in my hands. "What's in there, Dad? What was Mom's final message?" I held the sealed envelope for a long moment, feeling its weight in my hands. Margaret's final message, waiting for the right time to be read. But something told me that time had not yet come. The note said to open it when I was ready to forgive, and despite everything I had learned, despite the progress Daniel and I had made, I was not there yet. The wound was still too fresh, the anger still too raw. "Not yet," I told Daniel. "Your mother wanted me to wait until I was ready. I'll know when that is." He nodded, understanding without needing explanation. We left the bank with the investigator's report and returned to Linda's house, where the next phase of our ordeal was already beginning to unfold. The police arrived at Vanessa's door that afternoon, 2 detectives from the Financial Crimes Division, responding to the fraud complaint Everett had finally filed at my request. They did not arrest her, but they made clear she was under official investigation for mortgage fraud and forgery. I learned later that she had stood in the doorway, arms crossed, insisting she knew nothing about any forged documents. The detectives were not convinced. They took her computer and several boxes of files as evidence. Vanessa's response came within hours, and it was exactly the kind of desperate gamble I had come to expect from her. She posted a lengthy statement on social media, painting herself as the victim of a senile old man's delusions. She claimed I was mentally ill, that I had been making up stories to steal her husband's inheritance, that Daniel was being manipulated by a father who could no longer distinguish reality from fantasy. She used words like elder abuse and family betrayal, twisting the truth into a weapon aimed directly at my reputation. The post gained traction quickly. Strangers who knew nothing about our family left comments expressing sympathy for Vanessa and outrage at my supposed crimes. I watched the lies spread with a sickness in my stomach, wondering how many people would believe her, how much damage she could inflict before the truth caught up. Then Mrs. Hartley struck back. The elderly neighbor who had been quietly recording Vanessa's late-night phone calls released everything. Video after video appeared online, showing Vanessa screaming into her phone about debts and deadlines, begging for more time, promising money she did not have. The contrast between her composed social media persona and her unhinged private behavior was devastating. Within hours, the tide of public opinion had turned completely. Comments that had praised Vanessa now mocked her. Her carefully constructed image lay in ruins, but the recordings revealed something else, something I had not fully understood until investigators began tracing the phone numbers Vanessa had been calling. The debts that had driven her to such desperation, the money she owed that had pushed her to forge my signature, had not come from gambling or reckless shopping. She had given $200,000 to an ex-boyfriend named Marcus Webb, a man who had vanished 6 months before she kicked me out of the house. Mrs. Hartley had captured, the soft voice saying, "I'm doing this for us," had been directed at him. Vanessa had been bleeding the Kane family dry not to save herself, but to fund a man she had never stopped loving. Every lie she told Daniel, every scheme she constructed, every cruelty she inflicted on me had been in service of a relationship she maintained behind her husband's back. Daniel sat in Linda's living room as I explained what the investigation had uncovered. His face went through stages of grief I recognized from my own journey. Disbelief, then pain, then a cold anger that settled into his features like frost on a window. "She wasn't just using me," he said quietly. "She was using me to support someone else." Our entire marriage was a cover story for whatever she had with him. I moved to sit beside my son, placing a hand on his arm. "Your mother saw this coming, Daniel. Not the specific details, maybe, but the shape of it. She knew what kind of person Vanessa was, and she gave us the tools to survive it. The money, the documentation, the warnings." I squeezed his arm gently. "We're still standing because Margaret made sure we would be." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the truth. Outside, the sun was setting on another day of revelations, but for the first time, I felt something other than exhaustion. I felt resolution approaching, like the final pieces of a bridge clicking into place. My phone rang. Patricia Simmons, the lawyer Everett had recommended. Her voice was calm and professional, but I detected a note of satisfaction beneath the words. "Mr. Kane, we're ready to proceed with the eviction notice. Vanessa has 30 days to vacate your property." She paused. "Would you like to deliver it personally?" I chose to deliver the notice myself. Patricia offered to send a process server, someone professional and detached who would treat the moment as routine paperwork. But this was not routine, and it was not paperwork. This was the end of a chapter written in betrayal and silence, and I needed to close it with my own hands. Linda helped me prepare. She pressed my best suit, the charcoal gray one I had worn to Margaret's funeral, and polished my shoes until they reflected the morning light. I shaved carefully, trimmed my hair, and looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. The man staring back at me was not the broken figure who had slept in a truck 2 weeks ago. He was someone older and sadder, but also stronger. Someone who had survived what was meant to destroy him. Daniel wanted to come, but I asked him to wait at Linda's house. This confrontation needed to happen between Vanessa and me alone. Whatever she threw at me in those final moments, I wanted to face it without the complication of her husband watching. She had taken enough from my son already. She did not deserve the satisfaction of seeing him witness her humiliation. The drive to Maple Street felt longer than it should have. I passed familiar houses and familiar trees, landmarks of a life that suddenly seemed very far away. When I pulled into the driveway of my own home, the home Margaret and I had shared for 38 years, I sat for a moment with the engine running. Somewhere inside those walls, Vanessa was probably pacing, making phone calls, constructing new lies to replace the ones that had collapsed. She did not know I was coming. She did not know what I carried in the folder beside me. I turned off the engine, picked up the folder, and walked to the front door. My hand was steady as I rang the bell. Vanessa opened the door wearing sweatpants and a wrinkled blouse, her hair uncombed, her eyes red from crying or sleeplessness or both. When she saw me standing on her porch in my press suit, holding a legal folder with the calm demeanor of a man who has already won, her face went through a remarkable transformation. Surprise, then fear, then a desperate attempt at composure that failed almost immediately. "What do you want?" she demanded, but her voice cracked on the last word. I held out the folder. "This is a formal eviction notice. You have 30 days to vacate this property. The house is in my name. It has always been in my name. Your name appears on no deed, no title, no legal document of any kind. You have no claim to this home." She did not take the folder. Her hands remained at her sides, clenched into fists. "You can't do this. I live here. Daniel and I live here together. Daniel has already left. He's staying with me now." I kept my voice level, refusing to match her rising hysteria. "You have 30 days, Vanessa. I suggest you use them wisely." What followed was a performance I had seen variations of many times before, but never with such desperate intensity. She cycled through her entire repertoire, beginning with threats. She would sue me. She would have me arrested. She would destroy my reputation so thoroughly that no one in this town would ever speak to me again. When the threats produced no reaction, she shifted to tears, sobbing that she had nowhere to go, that I was condemning her to homelessness, that surely I could not be so cruel. When the tears failed, she tried bargaining, offering to leave quietly if I would just give her money, just enough to start over. Surely Margaret would have wanted that. I listened to all of it without moving, without responding, without giving her the satisfaction of any emotional reaction. When she finally fell silent, exhausted by her own theatrics, I spoke the words I had been carrying since the night she threw me out. "You showed no mercy to me, Vanessa. You put me on the street in February with nothing but a suitcase and told me never to come back. You didn't give me 30 days. You didn't give me 30 minutes. I paused, letting the memory settle between us. "I'm giving you 30 days. That's more than you deserve, and more than you gave me. Use them however you want." I set the folder on the porch railing and turned to leave. Behind me, I heard her voice one final time, stripped of performance, raw with something that might have been genuine hatred. "You'll regret this, Walter. I promise you. You'll regret this for the rest of your life." I stopped and looked back at her. She stood in the doorway of a house that had never been hers, wearing the ruins of a life she had built on lies, and I felt something unexpected, not triumph, not even satisfaction, just a profound weariness, and beneath it, the faintest whisper of pity. "The only thing I regret," I said quietly, "is not seeing what my wife saw years ago." I walked back to my truck without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rear-view mirror and saw Vanessa still standing in the doorway, the folder untouched beside her, her figure growing smaller until a turn in the road removed her from view entirely. The following days brought the grim theater of departure. Neighbors I had known for decades watched from porches and windows as Vanessa loaded boxes into a rental car. The woman who had carried herself with such superiority, who had dismissed me as a burden and an obstacle, was now the subject of whispers and pointed stares. I took no pleasure in her humiliation. I simply noted it, filed it away, and focused on the future Margaret had made possible. On the final day of the 30-day period, I returned to Maple Street to find the house empty. Vanessa had left without ceremony, without farewell, without even a forwarding address. I walked through the rooms she had occupied, touching walls Margaret had painted, windows Margaret had dressed with curtains, surfaces that still held the ghost of our shared life. The house felt different now, wounded, perhaps, but healing. Daniel met me on the front porch as the sun began to set. He had been quiet all day, wrestling with something I could not identify. When he finally spoke, his words caught me completely off guard. "Dad, I need to tell you something." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a familiar envelope, the sealed letter Margaret had left for me. Mom's letter, the one you weren't ready to open. He hesitated, guilt written across his... I read it. When you weren't looking, I read it. I'm sorry, but I needed to know what she said. He held the envelope out to me, his hand trembling slightly. And I think it's time you read it too. We sat together on the porch steps, father and son, watching the last light of day fade over the house that had witnessed so much pain. Daniel held the envelope out to me, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, the guilt of having violated something sacred mixed with the relief of finally sharing its burden. I took it from him without accusation. Whatever drove him to read it, I understood. We had both been starving for Margaret's voice, for her guidance, for some sign that she was still watching over us. The envelope was heavier than I expected, as if Margaret had packed decades of love into those few sheets of paper. I broke the seal with trembling fingers and withdrew her letter, written on the ivory stationery she had always favored for important correspondence. Her handwriting, so familiar that seeing it made my chest ache, filled 2 full pages. "My dearest Walter," she began, and I could hear her voice in every word. "If you're reading this, you've survived what I feared. You've weathered the storm I saw coming, and knowing you, you've probably won already. But winning isn't the same as healing, my love. Victory can leave wounds that fester if we're not careful." I paused, steadying myself. Daniel sat close beside me, reading along, his presence a comfort I had not expected to need so badly. Margaret's letter continued. "By now you know everything. The money I saved, the investigator I hired, the warnings I tried to give. You know that I spent my final weeks building walls instead of saying goodbye, and I hope you can forgive me for that. I hope you understand that protecting you was my way of loving you, even when I could no longer be there to do it in person." The next paragraph made me catch my breath. "I want to talk to you about forgiveness, Walter. Not the easy kind that people offer when they have no other choice, but the hard kind that costs something. Anyone can forgive when they're powerless. That's just acceptance dressed up in noble clothing. True forgiveness comes from strength. It comes when you have the power to destroy someone completely and choose mercy instead." I looked up at Daniel, who nodded silently, encouraging me to continue. "You now have that power," Margaret wrote. "You have the resources to pursue her legally, financially, personally. You could spend years making her pay for what she did to you, to Daniel, to our family. And part of me, the small petty part I tried to keep hidden, wants you to do exactly that. But the larger part of me, the part that loved you for 40 years and will love you for eternity, is asking you to choose differently. Choose mercy. Not for her sake, Walter. She doesn't deserve it. Choose mercy for yourself. Because hatred is a poison that kills the vessel that holds it, and I refuse to let that woman take anything else from you." Tears were streaming down my face now, dropping onto the paper, blurring some of the words. But I could still read the final paragraph, the lines Margaret had saved for last. "Don't let hatred define the rest of your life. You have years ahead of you, good years, years you should fill with peace and purpose, and maybe even joy. Live them fully. Live them freely. Don't waste a single precious day carrying anger that serves no one. That's my last gift to you, my love. Not money, not protection, but permission. Permission to let go. Permission to move forward. Permission to be happy again, even without me." I set the letter down and wept openly, not caring that Daniel saw, not caring about anything except the overwhelming presence of Margaret's love reaching across the boundary of death to hold me one more time. Daniel spoke quietly beside me. "There's a part about me too." Near the end, he pointed to a section I had not yet reached. That's why I read it. I needed to know if she forgave me for not believing her, for choosing Vanessa over her warnings. I found the passage he meant, "Our son has a good heart. He just needs someone to help him find it again. Be that someone, Walter. Help him become the man I always knew he could be." Daniel broke down beside me, and I pulled him close. 2 grieving men holding each other on the porch of a house filled with ghosts. When I finally reached the bottom of the envelope, my fingers touched something I had not expected. A small object, flat and rectangular. I pulled it out and found a USB drive with a label in Margaret's handwriting. "Press play when you're ready to start your new life." I turned the drive over in my palm, knowing what it contained. Margaret's voice, a recording she had made in her final weeks, preserved for this exact moment. "Walter," her written note beside it said, "I recorded this because I wanted you to hear my voice one more time. When you're ready, press play, and then go live." I waited 3 days before playing the recording. Part of me wanted to hear Margaret's voice immediately, to fill the silence she had left behind with the sound of her laughter, her wisdom, her love. But another part understood that some moments cannot be rushed. Margaret had asked me to press play when I was ready to start my new life, and I needed those 3 days to prepare myself for that beginning. On the fourth morning, I sat in Linda's living room with Daniel beside me. The USB drive connected to Linda's old laptop, and a simple audio file appeared on screen. I took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to a wife who had never stopped protecting me, and pressed play. Margaret's voice filled the room, clear and strong despite the illness that had been claiming her when she recorded it. "Walter, I know you're crying right now. Stop it." I laughed through my tears, exactly as she had predicted, exactly as she had intended. Even from beyond the grave, Margaret could read me like a book. "You were always the strong one, Walter," she continued. "You just never believed it. You thought I was the one holding our family together. But the truth is, you were the foundation. I was just the architect." Her voice softened, carrying decades of tenderness. "Now prove it by being happy. Not for me, for yourself. Go build something beautiful with whatever years you have left. That's an order." The recording ended, and silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. Fuller, somehow. More peaceful. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand. No words were necessary. We had both heard what we needed to hear. The following weeks brought unexpected developments. Patricia Simmons, my lawyer, contacted me about Margaret's complete will, sections that had been sealed until certain conditions were met. Among the provisions was one that made me smile through fresh tears. Margaret had designated a portion of her savings for whoever helps Walter in his darkest moment, because kindness deserves reward. She had not named anyone specifically. She had simply trusted that someone would appear, and she had prepared to thank them in advance. Linda wept when I told her. She tried to refuse, insisting she had only done what any decent person would do. But I reminded her of Margaret's philosophy about good people being rewarded. "She meant you," I said. "She saw you coming before you even knew we would need you." The money Margaret left behind was more than I could spend in several lifetimes, and I knew exactly what she would have wanted me to do with it. I worked with Everett and Patricia to establish the Margaret Kane Community Center, a resource for elderly people facing family abuse, financial exploitation, or abandonment. We purchased a building downtown, hired counselors and legal advocates, and created a place where people like me could find help before they found themselves sleeping in supermarket parking lots. Daniel threw himself into the project with an energy I had not seen in him for years. He volunteered every weekend, helping with construction, organizing donations, talking to other families who were walking the same painful road we had traveled. We did not speak much about Vanessa. There was nothing left to say. She had disappeared into whatever life awaited her, and we had chosen to focus on building rather than destroying. Our relationship healed slowly, the way all real healing happens. We could not erase the years of silence, the moments when Daniel had chosen comfort over courage, but we could build new memories on top of the old wounds, and that is what we did. Dinners together, long walks through the park where I had once taught him to ride a bicycle, conversations about Margaret that started with tears and ended with laughter. Day by day, we became father and son again. The community center opened on a Saturday in October, 6 months after Vanessa had driven away from Maple Street for the last time. The weather was perfect, the kind of crisp autumn day Margaret had always loved, and I stood at the entrance in my charcoal suit, watching families stream through the doors. A framed photograph of Margaret hung in the lobby, her silver hair catching the light, her smile as warm as the day I married her. I walked to the photograph and stood before it for a long moment. Around me, the center hummed with activity, with hope, with the beginning of something that would help people for generations to come. This was Margaret's true legacy. Not the money, not the protection, but the permission she had given me to transform pain into purpose. "You were right," I whispered to her image. "Forgiveness from strength is sweeter than any revenge." Linda appeared beside me, her eyes bright with emotion. She took my arm gently, and together we looked at the photograph of the woman who had brought us both to this moment. "She would be proud of you," Linda said softly. "She would be proud of all of us." The sun was setting outside, casting golden light through the windows, painting the lobby in shades of warmth and promise. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that somehow tasted cleaner than it had in years. The weight I had carried since Margaret's death, since Vanessa's betrayal, since that cold February night when I had nowhere to go, finally lifted from my shoulders. I looked back one last time at Margaret's photograph, and whispered the words that had been building in my heart since I first read her letter. "Thank you for never giving up on me, even when everyone else did." Then I turned and walked through the doors into my new life, free at last, dignified at last, and finally at peace. The doors closed behind me, not as an ending, but as a beginning. Walter Kane's story reminds us of a truth we sometimes forget. The people who love us never truly leave. Margaret saw the storm coming years before it arrived, and she spent her final days building an ark her husband did not know he would need. She could not stop the flood, but she made certain Walter would survive it. For those of you watching who have been mistreated by family, who have been made to feel like a burden in your own home, who have been pushed aside by people who should have protected you, I hope this story gives you something to hold on to. You are not alone. Your pain is real, and it matters. And sometimes, the people who seem to have all the power are actually the ones most afraid of losing control. Walter did not win because he was wealthy or powerful. He won because he refused to let cruelty define him. He chose dignity over revenge, forgiveness over hatred, and in the end, he built something beautiful from the wreckage of betrayal. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us about a time when kindness found you in your darkest moment. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story of resilience and justice. And remember, no matter how cold the night seems, morning always comes. Thank you for staying until the end. Your support means everything to us. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.